Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is my friend, Pastor Marvin Williams, who's a lead pastor at Trinity Church in Lansing, Michigan, who is also finishing his doctorate at Fuller Theological Seminary. And the title of his dissertation is My Whole Black Self, which focuses on self-differentiation of Black men living in predominantly white spaces, which is the topic of our conversation. Really learned a ton of this conversation. And as you'll see, Marvin is just an absolute delightful conversational partner, and just a solid pastor who I've looked up to for many years. The Exiles Conference, don't forget, is coming up April 3rd to 5th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're talking about all kinds of important and crucial topics. It's going to be a fantastic conference. If you want to attend live, you can do so. Space will start filling up soon, or you can live stream it if you can't make it out to Minneapolis. All the information is at theologyintheraw.com. All right. Please welcome to the show for the first time, my friend, Marvin Williams. Pastor Marvin Williams. It's been a while. It's been a minute.
Yeah.
Where did we met in Grand Rapids years ago. Was it like 6 years?
It's about 6 or 7 years ago. We were at Lori and Matthew Krieg. They were doing some work in terms of Hole in My Heart ministry, and I connected with Lori a while back, and when she and Matt came back to the Michigan area, they actually came to our church, and I interviewed them in terms of all the things that they were doing in terms of connecting with those who were dealing with their struggles with sexuality. And so Lori and Matt, they were one of my first interviewee. They were interviewees of as we talked about that particular issue during a sermon series we were doing.
Okay.
And
what city? Where are you at in Michigan?
I'm in Lansing.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
Yeah, I'm in Lansing, Michigan. And then after that, I think they hosted a conference, and you were one of the speakers. I was one of the speakers, and we got an opportunity to connect. And that probably was about 7 years ago, I believe.
I remember that conference. That was intense.
Yeah.
I remember Lori at the end. She almost collapsed out of just emotional exhaustion. She's just that girl leaves everything on the table when she's speaking. Well, you are in the middle of a doctoral program at Fuller Seminary, and you have a really interesting research project. Can you give us? Yeah, just tell us a little bit about it. And I would particularly love to hear kind of the backstory, like what led you to want to pursue this project. Super interesting.
Sure. So the title of it is My Whole Black Self. And this whole idea of self-differentiation, teaching Christ-centered self-differentiation, particularly to Black men who work in predominantly white spaces. Now, again, self-differentiation is a family systems theory concept. Murray Bowen is the godfather of family systems theory. He had some, obviously some other disciples along the way. Edwin Friedman, who wrote the book, A Failure of Nerve. And so several years ago, I was accepted into the doctoral project. And as I read, my first introduction to Murray Bowen's family systems theory was in the book, A Failure of Nerve. That literally changed the way I thought about my family, thought about the organization I was a part of, the church, is that every family or organization is an emotional system. When one person catches anxiety, it can easily become contagious where everyone catches anxiety. And so one of the concepts to deal with that is self-differentiation. And self-differentiation is this idea the ability to remain calm and connected to the person who is causing the reactivity, who is causing the anxiety, whether acute or chronic. And so I looked at my own life, and I recognized that in the leadership position that I was in as a senior teaching pastor, and then later on as the lead pastor, that I was catching other people's anxiety, and I was making decisions based on emotions and not being principle led. Some of the elders in our church who are no longer at our church right now, I I would get text messages and emails from them, at least one in particular, and I felt the anxiety. It took me, Preston, it took me several days to open some emails because there was a history of causing anxiety. And instead of leaning into it, I would withdraw. And so there's this sense where I just did not, I felt the anxiety all over me. And so so when I came in contact with this book and the idea of self-differentiation, I began to understand how do I define my principles so that when I'm in a situation like that again, I will lead not out of emotion, but out of principles. And then I began thinking, is that something that is a part of my ethnicity? Or is that something that's a part of my upbringing? I'm a Black pastor in a predominantly white church. And I began asking the question, how do I show up as my full Black self in this environment? How do I show up not thinking that, I have to continue to pay my dues as a Black man in this environment, but how do I show up as my full self as a Black man who belongs at the table, who I've been called to this church. God has called me here. And how do I show up with my full self without withdrawing or without enmeshing? Enmeshing is losing myself, losing my identity, to be kind of in groupthink versus withdrawing, saying that I don't want to have anything to do with this environment and I will kind of pull myself back. And so this concept of self-differentiation kind of moved me to say, no, how do I stay connected? How do I stay connected to God, stay connected to myself, and stay connected to the individuals and the organization that's causing the anxiety? And so my hope is to teach the tool of self-differentiation to Black men who either minister or work in predominantly white spaces, so they can show up as their full selves and not kind of split. As W.E. Du Bois says, that there is something called double consciousness. And double consciousness is when particularly a Black person shows up in one space one way and shows up in another space in a different way. And so he is saying, I'm trying to get Murray Bowen and W.E. Du Bois to talk to each other and say, how do we show up as Black men, as our full selves in spaces that sometimes may not want us there, but also in spaces where that might cause a lot of anxiety because we might be the only one. There might be microaggressions, those kinds of things. So anyway, that's kind of, I know that's a lot of it's a lot there, but that's kind of the idea that I'm going after.
So you'll have to excuse me. I might ask some dumb questions, partly because I'm an idiot, and partly because I might be thinking, I wonder if somebody is thinking maybe somebody else is an idiot, and I'm trying to be a medium to funnel their thoughts. Is your experience as a Black man in predominantly white spaces and these things you're wrestling with, would you say that's very common for many or all Black men in similar spaces? And then I would love to know, what does that feel like in your body? Can you unpack kind of that experience for the listeners?
Yeah, I think, and again, everyone has different experiences, but I think there are some, there are some, similarities across the board, whether you're the only one or whether it is microaggressions that some people in white spaces may not even be fully aware of. For instance, when I first started at the church where I am, we were doing a series in the book of Malachi. We were talking about just, kind of justice and injustice. And I had one guy come up to me and say, I need you to forgive me. And I began asking, why do you need me to forgive you? He says, because when you candidated here, I didn't vote for you. And I said, well, I'm quite sure a lot of people didn't vote for me. But he said, you need to understand why I didn't vote for you. I did not vote for you because you were Black.
Wow.
And in my upbringing and in my life, I've had, Black individuals to hurt and harm me with their words and their actions. And so he immediately put me in that space. And I said, no, that's okay. And he said, no, you need to hear me. I really need you to forgive me. I deflected. And he said, I really need you to forgive me because I don't want my son growing up with that kind of anger and hatred toward Black people. And there in the beginning, at the front of the front of the auditorium, we prayed, we cried, and it was a moment that I recognized that he was a microcosm of what I was feeling in other people. It felt like I was being tolerated, even though I had been there about 3 years. Felt like I was being tolerated as opposed to accepted. Now that is a, the Spirit didn't tell me that. I just felt it. And I felt, the same people asking the same or saying the same thing. We're so glad you're here. We're so glad you're here. After 3 years, after 5 years, we're so glad you're here. And so it was that those kinds of physiological feelings, so emotional feelings, the way people kind of treated me as a novelty, as opposed to, no, I'm your pastor. I really am your pastor, and God has called me here, and I'm not the token, here at Trinity Church. And so 14 years later, it's been a good ride.
What was that? Was that a good thing that he came to you and says, "I need you to forgive me"? Are you're framing that positively? Obviously, his previous posture was pretty toxic, but did he do the right thing and approaching you that way?
Oh, I think he did. I think he did. That was a good part. The not so good part is I started thinking how many people sat on that and did not come to me, but felt the same way. Okay. And there were some people anecdotally who left the church because kind of through the rumor mill, if you will, that I just don't want, a Black man leading me in this predominantly white church. And so, so I had to deal with that. And I had to find ways like what is the guiding principle in me? And the guiding principle in me is not based on what other people think about me, but it really is, I have a definite call, number one, to ministry, and a definite call to the place where God called me in this church in Lansing. And so that became the thing that the guiding principle for me as as a pastor in a predominantly white church. And I believe that has to be, anyone who's working in a predominantly white space, it has to be a call from God, as opposed to I'm deciding to work in this space and trying to change this space because it's predominantly white and we need it to be multi-ethnic. Has to be the calling has to be one of the guiding principles that brings you there, and I believe that keeps you there.
Okay. What are some other common microaggressions that you have faced in predominantly white spaces, and also are your common experiences, is that common to other Black men in predominantly white spaces?
Yeah.
What are some things we're doing that we don't realize we're doing?
Well, one in particular. So being in Grand Rapids, I was a part of Calvary Church in Grand Rapids, and that's where I met Claire DeGraff, a mutual friend of ours, and so I got an opportunity to being at Calvary, I got a chance to speak in a lot of predominantly white churches. And there are a couple of churches after I spoke. There's a gentleman who came up to me and said, "I listened to your entire message and I did not find one thing wrong with it." And I'm saying, well, thank you. Thank you for that. That to me, he was searching for something that I would say that that he could find wrong. And then I asked him, "Do you do that to your pastor? Do you do that to other guest speakers who are not African American?" And his answer was surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, no, he did not. And yet, so he found it okay to do it, to me. So there's a sense, is a Black preacher or pastor on the same level as a white pastor or a white scholar, so forth and so on. And so there feels like there's again, this is all anecdotal, like a freedom to question the theology of a Black pastor or a Black leader in the church. And so that's one that's one that came up in terms of a microaggression. Or what I wear. If I'm wearing an authentically African piece of garb as clothing to preach in, there are individuals who've looked at me as like, wow, what is that? And why are you wearing that? And so, and some days I intentionally do it because that's a part of my own differentiation to say, no, this is who I am. This is part of who God created me to be. And so, those are some examples of things that I've experienced being in some predominantly white spaces.
Do you have any other examples? I'm curious. Like, what are some other microaggressions people do?
Yeah. So there's one where when back maybe about 5-6 years ago, when we had a lot of the police shootings, I decided to do a message on the irrationality and sinfulness of racism. And this is partly on me. So I talked about racism, but I'm typically an extemporaneous preacher. So I have my outline, I have my notes. But this time, I made sure that I manuscript the entire message, and I spoke from the entire the manuscript as opposed to being more extemporaneous. Here's the reason why. That I recognize that there are people in the congregation who would view my extemporaneous preaching as high-level emotion, and I'm talking about a highly emotional issue with high emotion, and they would view that as the angry Black man. And so I made sure that I manuscript the entire message, and I basically preached the message from very controlled, very very kind of like in the pocket, as opposed to being emotional, because I recognized that it could be construed as, oh, why is Marvin so angry? Why is Marvin so angry over this issue? And I wanted to make sure that I maintained a level of equilibrium so that the message could be heard. The following Sunday, a man came up to me and said, I know you got a lot of emails. I know you got a lot of text messages from that particular message. And I said, Pete, I didn't get one email. I didn't get one message from anyone in the congregation. And he thought that was very strange. And then he said, I wonder if you didn't get any messages from people is because you have basically earned the right to to speak like that. He said, had you preached that message 5 years ago when you or when you first came, people probably would have tuned you out and left the church because of the very reasons we were talking that I mentioned, that it would be viewed I would be viewed as an angry black man, and they probably would not have been able to take that. And so being able to live among the people, get the smell of the sheep on me, allowed me to preach that message in a way that I hopefully honored God, as well as expressed my own experience as a black man dealing with racism, as well as leading the congregation to think differently about the issues of race, and particularly the relationship with policing in our society.
Yeah.
And so those are again that is something maybe I was in my own head, but I don't think so, because there were individuals afterwards who said, even police officers in our congregation said, Marvin, I would love to take you on a ride so that you can see what we do, so that the fear or the anxiety or the tension that you have, we can allay that, because we're trying to do our job and doing our job well. And I mentioned in the message, 99% of the police officers that I know and who do the job, they do it well, and they do it according to the standard that's been set. And so anyway, that's one of the issues that I dealt with, that came up in my ministry here at Trinity.
So you mentioned the question came to me as you're just talking at the very end there. Your and I know, so you can't speak for all black men, so this is your individual experience, but like you mentioned like this in maybe an anxiety you might have when you get pulled over by a cop or drive by a cop. Is that's fairly common among black men in particular? And given what you just said about most cops are good cops, it's not a big deal. Like, would you say that that's a legitimate anxiety, or do you see that as projecting upon cops something that's not there?
Yeah, again, can't speak for. I dare not speak for all black men.
Yeah.
Um, Yet there are many in my circle who would probably feel some level of anxiety, um, based on, you don't have to necessarily be doing anything wrong
Yeah.
for that anxiety to show
Yeah.
up. There are individuals who have been stopped just because,
Yeah.
whether it's profiling and or simply, whether you're driving or you're walking or you're in a crowd. I just know that from my circle, parents have given their sons in particular the talk.
Right.
When you are driving, make sure if you're ever stopped, you're respectful, you honor, the police officers, you keep your hands at 2 and 10, and you don't do anything that would give anyone a reason to do anything nefarious. And so all the people in my circle, most parents have had that conversation with their sons. Now, can't speak for
Yeah.
every black person, every black man, but I do know that there is some level of anxiety when there is some level of interaction
Yeah.
with police officers.
And I want to go back and clarify. My question could have sounded like I was implying that it's projection. But the reason why I ask is because I think almost, if not every black man in particular that I've talked to says they've actually have experienced some kind of profiling, being pulled over for no reason, so that there's legitimate reason to have that anxiety. It's not just, oh, I heard cops can be bad and, I'm going to project that on them. No, they have actually had experiences that are uh, that lie behind the anxiety. So it's
Yeah.
kind of a legit
Yeah.
thing. So yeah, when I was in California years ago, I was teaching at a small Bible college, and we probably had maybe 2 Black people at the college. I mean, and it wasn't, it was lots of actually a lot of Koreans, Hispanics, and so it wasn't just all white, but we had like
Right.
1 or 2 Black people. And I used to drive a 1992. Oh, what was it? Some big old. I'm trying to think of the car. Was it some kind of sedan? I mean, it looked like a drug dealer car. I mean, it was, and the shocks were out in the back, so it was low. The back was lower. It looked like I was carrying a dead body in the car. Never been pulled over. And I had this thing where I would, if I went on a trip, I would just loan it out to a student. And this one trip I went on, I loaned it out to a Black student, and he drove me down to LAX, and he drops me off. I found out later he got pulled over 45 seconds later.
You gotta be kidding.
No,
45 seconds
he was
later.
pulling out. It was like he was still at LAX and he got pulled over by a cop. And again, it's like, you could say, yeah, but what about this? I don't know. All I know is I drove the thing for it was a Crown Victoria, 1992 Crown Victoria.
Yeah.
And in 5 years, I never got pulled over. And within a minute, this dude got pulled over.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think that is, it's a reality. It's a reality that that exists in our world. Again, in teaching the whole idea of self-differentiation, you can easily become. I don't know his response to that. Was it?
Yeah.
Was it?
He
what was his response?
I mean, he was like, yeah, clearly I got pulled over because I was Black, but he was like laughing. I mean, he was like, he had a really good attitude, at least externally. I mean, maybe internally he was really scared. I don't know. That's a good question. Now that, that was years ago, so I didn't even think about like, hey, what was that really like for you? I was just like, oh, he kind of laughed it off and, joked around with students and stuff. But and I don't think I don't think he was harassed or anything, but just the fact that he got pulled over when I've never been pulled over. And maybe it's coincidence. I don't know.
Well, again, it's part. It doesn't have to turn into something that is, that is significantly, horrible. I mean, it can be he can laugh it off, but I would imagine that something internally was raised up in him. Some level of anxiety was raised up in him. And how we deal with that anxiety, how we approach it, can determine whether, what happens in the next minute, the next 2 minutes, the next 3 minutes. And where there's a lack of emotional regulation, it can turn into something that we would that just it would not turn out good. So
yeah. You mentioned tokenism. What does that feel like when people aren't being at all like negative towards you, for lack of better terms, but it's almost like there could be almost like an over the top, maybe pandering or paternalistic, like could there be like almost an obnoxious celebration that we have a Black pastor, we're the cool kids in town. Do you ever you ever experience that, and what does that feel like?
Yeah. Again, it is. Are you is a person accepting me for my authentic self, or is a person accepting me because it's the skin I'm in, and it is a novelty. The interesting part is the novelty wears off when the novelty wears off when a person does differentiate and say, hey, that is what you're doing, and what you're saying is not is number one, is inauthentic. Number two, it really is a microaggression. For instance, when we had there was a weekend where I can't remember the all of the situation, but there was a black man. I think it was the Aubrey case where he was killed running through a community in Atlanta. And then the bird watcher, something Christian, he was called, a white woman called the police on him and saying that this man is harassing me, and that was never the case. And so there was a lot of tension, and on our staff, that morning, it was just a horrible weekend. I just felt the weight of that moment. And we went on with our staff meeting like nothing ever happened. And I kind of felt a little bit of maybe a little bitterness, because we've been doing life together, we've been doing ministry together for all these years. And no one said, "Hey, Marvin, I know that this must feel weighty and heavy. Is there anything I can do to pray for you during this time?" I got a text message from someone who's not a part of our church, not a part of our staff, who said, "Hey, I just want you to know that I'm standing with you and standing for you. I know that this must hurt." And so in that moment, I felt like the 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 right thing to do was to, if this was a good relationship, was to say, I just want to check in on you. Just want to check in on to see how you're doing. So I sent a message to everyone saying that, how come no one actually said anything? And that was a moment of differentiation, if you will. And then everyone began to say, "Oh, are you okay? Are you okay?" Well, it's too late now. I really would have appreciated something earlier, as opposed to you responding when I said something. I think when talking about the issue of race, talking about the issue of multi-ethnicity, talking about the issue of not just tolerating one another, but celebrating one another, I think in moments of that kind of differentiation, I think the tokenism goes away. And then I think people begin to say, like, you should have just stayed in the corner and not said anything, because when you did not talk about the bigger issues, everything seemed to be okay. But when the moment you start talking about the issue of race, or talking about the issue of multi-ethnicity, talking about the issue of celebration versus toleration, that's when you kind of cause anxiety in us. And so I think there's a sense where when a person begins to differentiate, tokenism goes away, and then people have to deal with the authenticity of the moment. What are the facts? What are the issues that we need to deal with in terms of race, in terms of whether it's sexuality or other things as well? And it does feel like the person is not looking at me as my authentic self, as Marvin Williams, but someone who's a Black pastor that we get to hold up in kind of this, this is our shiny new toy. That was in my first, the first part of ministry. It's not even an issue now, because I love the people, and the people love me, and we have a really good relationship.
So how did you take them from where they were to where they are now, to where there's minimal, say, tokenism, there's probably a lot fewer microaggressions? Is this something you actively had to teach your congregation, or was it just them getting to know you as a person for many, many years, that all the superficial stuff wears off, and now they love and respect Marvin for who?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination of both. It is teaching the scripture. It is, line by line, we, as we talk about the scripture, as we you know, teach the book of James and James 2. We get a chance to talk about those things. And we get a chance to talk about why racism is sinful and irrational. Um, and over the years, we've done that. But then also, the consistency of living among the people, the consistency of discipling people, the consistency of showing up as my authentic self and not feeling like I have to compromise who God has created me to be. And I think when people see that, um, I think it gives them an opportunity to be their authentic selves as well, to actually ask questions. I had a gentleman to ask me about 3 years ago, after I had been there, 11 years, like, can you tell me what it's like to be an African American in a predominantly white church? Like this is after 11 years, and he finally asked the question. And prior to that, he probably would not have asked that question. But I think because he got to know me and I got to know him, he was able to ask that question and not feel embarrassed by it, but to actually say, I know you well enough now to be able to ask that question. I wish he had asked it earlier. And yet we had a great conversation around that. So I think it's a combination of both. I think it's a combination of the teaching being true to scripture, and then being true to who I am and living among the people and loving the people well enough so they know that if I say hard things, if I give hard teachings, it's not because I'm angry. It's not because I have an agenda. It truly is because I love them and I desire God's best for them.
Hey friends, if Theology in the Raw has blessed or challenged you in any way, would you consider supporting the show through Patreon at patreon.com/Theology in the Raw? We are actually revamping our bonus material that Patreon supporters get. So we are going to 2 bonus Q&As per month for all the different paid levels. Silver level gets access to ask questions for the Q&A episode. And also, you will get access to Exiles in Babylon archived content, which will be releasing different videos every month. Also, access to bonus research episodes that I'm gonna record from time to time. Access to rough drafts of certain things I'm working on, which is a little scary for me to let people look into that because it's a rough draft. Gold and Gold Plus members get we have monthly Zoom chats and all the other perks that the other tiers get access to as well. So again, if you want to support the show, it really, really does help us to flourish as a ministry. Again, patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. I will see you in the community. I think sometimes, for at least some white people, if I can speak on behalf of some white people, especially post 2020, post say 2014 with Trayvon Martin and obviously Ferguson and everything, there's just like nervousness about saying something wrong in the race conversation. Like, what if I ask a question that's offensive? What if I, should I say black or African American, and when do I say what? And what if I say something stupid? And so sometimes we just don't, out of fear of perpetuating race or racism or not knowing how to enter the race conversation, we just kind of shrink back and like, oh, I'm just not going to say anything, where I've had to just say, I'm just going to be authentic and honest and kind, and also be like, hey, I've got lots of blind spots, ignorances. Yep. Can you help me out here? I don't know. And just say, hey, if I say something that's offensive, please correct me. Like I want to grow.
I think what you're saying, Preston, is the best route. Is instead of saying, I know a lot, and to try to sound like you know a lot, or you're smart on this particular issue, you've read a number of books on this issue. The best thing to do is, hey, listen, I want to let you know up front, I want to get to know you a little bit better. I want to talk about this issue in a way that's intelligent, but also compassionate. I want to talk about this issue truthfully, but also in a compassionate way. And so I am going to say some things that are probably like really, really, dumb, or you might consider a microaggression, you might consider
Yeah.
racist, or like you're so articulate. Like, oh no, don't say that word. No, don't say that
Wait,
word.
explain that a little more. Like, why
So
is that not good?
so why is it that Black people are articulate and white people are never, that word is never used among for the most part among white
Yeah.
people, but among Black people it is, it is, you don't know how to talk. And so because you don't know how to talk, when you finally find someone who talks, quote unquote, who talks white, you're articulate. And so that is one of those microaggressions. And again, I got that early on. He is so articulate, and I'm saying, please do not say that. Just because I've never heard you say that with other individuals. So being able to say, like, I am going to say some things and I hope we can laugh about them. And I really want you to, I really want there to be a symbiotic relationship where I am learning from you, you're learning from me, and maybe we can walk this road together and challenge one another. But I think when we show up inauthentically, that's when I think it opens the door for arrogance. It opens the door for I'm perfect, I know all of this, and I think it hurts the relationship. But what you just said, hey, I'm going to make some mistakes. I'm going to probably make a lot of mistakes. But I would hope that you would show up embodying Jesus in this moment with both grace and truth, telling me the truth about myself, but also doing it graciously and with a sense of winsomeness that I think is super, super important.
Yeah. I'm curious, 2020, so much is happening, and there was, it seemed like a lot of conversations about race that were opening up. It's a little bit embarrassing that it takes, several killings to say, hey, maybe we should start talking about race. But there were some good conversations. There were some bad conversations. There were some heated conversations. There were some unhelpful conversations, but there were conversations, and there were some really good ones happening. From my vantage point, it seems like those started to kind of die down after 2020. Is that your perception, or do you feel like we as a church have progressed very helpfully since 2020 in talking about race in healthy ways? Or do you feel like we've kind of gone back to kind of where we were pre 2020? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. I think I think some of the conversations have died down. With the advent of getting rid of, DEI. And again, I'm not, I think it's helpful, but they're across the board now. You have a lot of organizations actually rolling back some of the things that they've done, whether it is diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, or at least conversations. Now that we've had a Black president, he's no longer in office. Now that we have a different person in office, we now don't have to talk about those issues because it's not a problem. So I think we have seen some of it die down, and I think there's not as much energy in talking about issues of race and inclusion and multi-ethnicity and diversity as during the time of 2020. And I don't know the reasons. I don't know all the reasons for that. We've made a lot of progress, and so let's just stick with that. Or the fact it is very, very difficult. It's very difficult to unlearn some things and then to learn some new things, learning how to exist with, not just exist, but to celebrate one another. It's a very difficult thing to do. And it's easy to talk about. it's very difficult to begin to change your life around issues of diversity and inclusion and
Yeah.
multi-ethnicity. Check your phone. Who are the last contacts? Who are the people that you're spending the most time with? Um, you know, um, and who are the individuals in the last 30 days that you've called? If everyone in your contact list in the last 30 days have just looked like me,
Yeah.
that is, I'm talking about myself, Marvin Williams, then you are not really practicing diversity as a spiritual habit. If everyone in your contact list over the last 30 days looks like Preston Sprinkle, talking to you now, then, but yet verbally I say I am for, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the body of Jesus. We see in heaven, there's going to be a throng of people from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different tribes and tongues. Then I have an aspiration, but not an actualization of that spiritual habit. I
Yeah.
think diversity should be a spiritual habit, just like fasting, just like prayer, just like simplicity, just like silence and solitude. And yet it has to be intentional, because left to our own devices, I will default to people who look like me, sound like me, and live like I do,
Yeah.
versus the intentionality and consistency of being with people who are different than I am, and to learn from them.
So you've mentioned DEI a few times. This apparently has become a hot button issue in politics. Like it's been. So I honestly don't know. I've never been through a DEI training. I don't really know what's happening. I just see people using this as a really negative thing. And
Yeah,
I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe I don't know. But I was part of I helped produce a study Bible called the Upside Down Kingdom Study
yeah,
Bible, and one of the fundamental principles is that we're going to have uh, ethnic and sex diversity among the authors. Like we tried to get 50% men, 50% women, roughly. We tried to get no one ethnicity would be more than 50% of the authors. So we really worked hard
sure.
to make it diverse. And for me, this is a theological. This is a profoundly theological issue, right? I mean, I think
Ephesians 2, right?
all over the
Yeah,
place. Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
we're going to be, yeah, God's on a mission to create a multi-ethnic church, and he's going to
yeah.
win in the book of Revelation when we're all singing in, different tongues and languages and everything. So for me, it's like, it's not even, I didn't even think about, didn't cross my mind the political aspect of it. But now the Bible has been called the DEI Bible, the
Yeah,
woke Bible,
they
all these
came for
things.
your head. I saw that. They came for your head on that. So I saw some of like you're woke, and it's like they really
Yeah.
did try to drag you on that. So
Oh, it's all over the place. I don't. It's for me. That's just Tuesday. I mean, it's like all I have to do is go online. What's the latest Twitter
right,
account with some fish head profile making fun of me or something, whatever.
right.
But it was like, oh wow, what? So they just read this through a political lens. That's just interesting. But then it caused me to think, like, what is, like, I'm coming at it from a theological angle. People are projecting some kind of political secular
Yeah.
lens on it. I'm curious. So how would you articulate the difference between what a secular political movement, what's behind their desire for, say, DEI versus a more theological passion for diversity? Are there, it can't be the same thing, right? But I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah. And again, I think you mentioned it. You're looking through a theological lens, and you're seeing that this is germane to what it means to be in the body of Jesus. This is a no brainer, if you will, for Christians. So for those who follow Jesus, and so that lens is very, very different than a political lens. Political lens is who has the power,
mm,
and is it again, you talk about the upside down kingdom. It is the marginalized that Jesus says has the power, and not those who are those who are those who have the actual power. And so you have this sense of with coming from a political sense, who has the power, who's at the table, and and um and there have been years and years of oppression and suppression. Now it's time for us to turn the tables so that those who are oppressed, and this is partly true of the political lens, those who are oppressed can easily now become the oppressors. And that is not what we see. That's not what we are after. And so now there is the politicization of, we now want you to feel guilty about all the harm that you've caused in oppressing one one ethnic group. But again, coming from a theological point of view, this is part of what it means to be in the kingdom of God. And if we if we don't frame it that way, you can be viewed as someone who is politicizing the gospel, who is, a woke theologian, who is not orthodox in your thinking. And so even if you frame it that way, you still have people looking through a political lens as opposed to a theological lens. And so I think it's so important to keep the theological, the biblical lens out front, and frame it that way before talking about that other stuff.
Yeah. And I think another difference I see is like, and I don't know if this is what's behind secular DEI programs or whatever, but there could be that kind of like white savior, white guilt, white liberal paternalistic, like, there's these, less qualified people of color for this job, but we needed to include them anyway because we need diversity. Where a theological lens is the same Spirit of God dwells all ethnicities.
Absolutely.
I don't need to lower the bar to get some black scholar. There's plenty of brilliant black scholars that oftentimes are left out of white spaces because they're not white. And maybe it's intentional, maybe unintentional, whatever. But I'm like, no, the gifts are spread equally among all people.
Oh, absolutely.
So
I love that.
I'm not lowering some standard. Almost every author has a PhD that contributed to the Bible. It's not like I'm like, stooping down to, include people that don't have the skill set to be included otherwise. So, I say, yeah.
No, that could be. And there are, on either side, there are individuals who, in order to fill a spot or a quota, if you will, we have to find someone who is, we're not trying to find someone less qualified, but we want to have someone who has, the skin I'm in, to fill that position, to say that we do have diversity. And I would say you're absolutely right. There are, black scholars all over the place who should be sitting at, theological tables and are not. And again, I don't know all the reasons, but whether it is Latin American theologians, whether it is Asian theologians, Asian preachers, Latin preachers, should be sitting at those tables, and not to fill a quota, but because, as you mentioned, they have the Spirit of God living inside of them, and they have something to say that's profoundly important to the rest of the body of Jesus.
And another, I guess, difference is the sort of, and this is where I would just simply disagree with my, more right-wing politicized crowd, the anti-woke crowd, is like, I actually see benefit for interpreting the Bible with having multi-ethnic perspectives, where a lot of, I think, my right-wing friends would say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You can have all white people as long as they're following exegesis, whatever, and they're interpreting the Bible correctly. That's all that matters. And I'm like, no, we do bring our past, our ethnicity, our gender, our socioeconomic status. different cultural, like that actually does influence our interpretation, so that a multi-ethnic community of interpreters is
Yeah.
going to be better, assuming they're all good interpreters,
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
simply a mono-ethnic perspective. So, but
Yeah,
that's they're going to say no, it doesn't matter. I'm like, well, it does. So,
well, and you're stepping all in Esau McCauley's
yeah,
reading while black,
yeah,
just bringing the experience. Again, as he writes, he's bringing his experience. He's bringing an orthodox interpretation to Scripture, but he's also bringing this other lens that is just as important, to see how Black people experience the Bible in very different ways. How do we speak truth to power without calling it wokeism, without calling it non-orthodox? And you have, whether it is Esau McCauley or the late great Desmond Tutu, who again spoke truth to power, but again, loving God, loving the scriptures. And so again, I think when looking at other people's experiences, we can't discount them.
right.
You can look at CT and other you can look at CT and other organizations that have done kind of evaluations. That you have the Black church. The Black church has always been viewed, again, among some, as liberal, and yet all of the evaluations say that you can look at Black churches and probably more orthodox in their theology, and yet the Black church has this other aspect of how do we actually bring the gospel to bear on social concerns, on social ills, on schools that are marginalized, or other things in the Black community. The gospel has always spoken to those things. I think the gospel is inherently not just spiritual, but it is emotional and physical. It is inherently that.
Right.
And so I think we see in the Black church how the gospel actually speaks to those issues, and so that there is a more well-rounded gospel, and not just when you die, you go to heaven.
Well, is it partly because it's just not an option, right? I mean, when you're living in a context, grew up in a context where social concerns were not some idea out there, but were part of the fabric of your day-to-day life.
Absolutely.
Then you just naturally start asking, how does the gospel apply to this? Like I've got a lot of, I'll just take a quick turn this way, but like a lot of Palestinian friends in the West Bank, and in Gaza. And for them, like, how does the gospel apply to justice? It's just not like they don't have to like think of that question. It's just in their bones, So
absolutely.
And I mean, many parts of the world. I got friends in Nepal. Same thing. I mean, there's to be a Christian in Nepal, it's small percentage. They're often persecuted and everything, and so but for people that are living in a context where they're not having to ask those questions, then it seems like it's just easy to separate those questions from the gospel.
I'm reminded of in this is a while back, but the late Desmond Tutu, he spoke on the year anniversary of the terrorist attacks in the United States. And it was 2002. He starts off by identifying with the pain of, so he's both pastoral and prophetic, identifying with the pain of those in America who have dealt with the grief of the terrorist attack. And he does that. He says, God is with you, and God loves you. But then he makes this slight turn, and he says, for the first time in America, you understand fragility. You understand vulnerability. And he said, he said, now understanding this, maybe you will now understand the vulnerability and fragility of our brothers
Mm.
and sisters literally around the world
Wow.
who have to deal with without water and without food and dealing with poverty on a day-to-day basis. This
Yeah.
one event showed you your vulnerability. You've always been vulnerable and fragile, but you're just now understanding it with this attack. Now maybe you can understand what our brothers
Yeah.
and sisters around the world are dealing with on a daily basis.
Yeah.
He says, until we fight the terrorism of poverty and the other ills, then we won't fully be able to fight these kind of terrorist attacks. And
Oh.
taking money away from investing in weapons of mass destruction
Yeah.
to investing in the
Mm.
ills of society that causes fragility and vulnerability and marginalization around the world.
Yeah.
Now, again,
Mm.
he in a very, very kind of a velvet glove kind of way, he said, I'm with you, America. I pain, I hurt with you, but also he's now speaking truth to power to say
Mm-hmm.
this is a reality, and maybe now we can raise our eyes to
Mm-hmm.
brothers and sisters who are dealing with marginalization and fragility around the world. I love it.
I bet some people probably took that as him like celebrating or 9/11 or something, or saying it was a good thing. But
But if you listen to him,
I would miss the point.
he's probably the most pastoral voice.
Yeah.
His voice never changed. I mean, it was almost
Yeah.
as if, a grandfather was sitting talking to his
Yeah.
grandchildren. And I love the tonation of how he talked about both the pastoral part, but
Mm,
also the prophetic part.
that's
And
good.
and you could tell he loved the people even as he was sharing this.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Got a comment from a patron. We got some patrons tuning in here. This is a really good observation. This person says it's so interesting how these communication principles are applicable not only in the context of racial differences, but of any human differences: gender,
Yeah.
single, married. I would even add um, uh, sexuality too. Obviously, all these differences don't perfectly map on each other. There's differences, but would you say like anybody who has some kind of minority experience in a majority context, that the stuff you're talking about earlier with communication, that a lot of these cross over, that these
Absolutely.
apply to different? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're going to, and I suppose it depends on the context and it depends on the person, but I would imagine the majority black and brown,
Mhm.
it would be true. But I would also say if you are Asian and you're coming
Mm,
to the United States and you're engaging U.S. for the first time, there's an anxiety that
mm,
everyone who deals with that. And so, what does it look like to differentiate? What does it look like to remain calm in the midst of reactivity? So, I think it's a principle. Even though my study is regarding Black men, I think the principles of self differentiation really do cross over to any and every culture. That any and every culture, as well as gender as well.
okay. Yeah. Okay. Before we go, big picture, best pieces of advice for uh, listeners who are part of the majority. Well, let's just say white listeners, when they have a small percentage of people who are not white in their context. What can white people, as part of the majority, do to make that context more thriving for people who are, let's just say, ethnic minorities?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would again have a conversation with that person in their context or individuals in that context, and just simply ask questions. Ask questions. Is there anything in our context that that you see that does not include a kind of a thoughtful uh, idea on diversity? Or is there something that we have done in this context that has caused anxiety in you, that has either caused you to enmesh, not to say anything at all, kind of give away your identity, or even withdraw? And if the person is honest, and just say, I really do need you to be honest. Tell us, because we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
So I think asking the question, is there anything in our context that has caused levels of reactivity or anxiety in you and your family for that reason in this context? So I think the asking the question, asking the question and then getting to know the person a little bit better, I think is important. And then I think for individuals to, if there's someone who's done work in this space, to invite them in and say, you have carte blanche to understand some of the things that we're doing and how maybe some of that could be a barrier to individuals in our context. Like, one of the things that we've done, and we've not done this like we beat the bully pulpit. Like, half of our elders are ethnic, so half are white and half are ethnic. And so when you look, when you look at our page or you look at our elders, the leadership is definitely diverse, and I think it warrants that. So again, beginning in leadership spaces could be very helpful. Not tokenism, but truly qualified individuals to serve in the body of Jesus.
Derwin, I think you know Derwin, right? Derwin Gray?
Yep, Derwin Gray. Yep.
He said, it's such a high value at their church that he says you will never see on stage. You will always see on stage the kind of diversity, age, socioeconomic, even ethnic, sex. You will always see on stage the kind of church we are trying to embody. And they do. It's you would never see all white people, all young people, or whatever on stage.
It model what you hope to get. So,
Marvin Williams, this has been fun. Thanks so much for the conversation. Really appreciate you, and we should do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Preston.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.